You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you till you take my sunshine away. The other night, dear, while I was sleeping, I dreamt I held you in my arms. When I awoke, dear, I was mistaken. So I held my head and I cried. That was the song that my father sang to me every night before going to sleep because I was afraid of the dark. I sing this song tonight for a couple of reasons. What was happening? Well, it was a song that comforted me when I was a child. It was also a song that I remember now that helps me find a meaning in the catastrophe that happened in my life. It also gives me the opportunity to honestly say that I have sung at the National Greek Opera. You're all witnesses. The other thing that's happening is that instantly it created a moment of shared attention in which your heartbeats began to synchronize. You began to wonder, why is the WHO technical officer singing? And that anticipation of both the melodic line, but also trying to figure out what he was doing and why, created a dopamine effect. And in the deep aesthetic experience, when it eventually lands at that moment of revelation, which is both, it gives a feeling of inevitability, but also surprise, is what Aristotle called that moment of catharsis. You get a little shot of oxytocin, which creates that sense of awe, and also reinforces a sense of community of people in the room. This is all part of the underlying neurology of the healing power of the arts. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Nigeria for helping support their National Arts and Health Week, and I was meeting in this little clearing, this man named Sigun, who had spent the last 20 years in this old abandoned factory space that he was squatting in, creating a community theater to help the community deal with their everyday problems and the issues that they were facing. And we sat at sunset sipping herbal tea and trading war stories. I was telling him about some of the work that we were doing through our Jameel Arts and Health Lab of working with freed Yazidi women, freed from captivity, using the arts to try and gain repossession of their bodies, their story, their future. And he was telling me stories of what he was doing, his practice in that slum in Lagos. And at one point he stops and he turns to me and he says, you know, I don't really agree with what you're doing. And I said, so what am I doing? And he said, well, positioning the arts as curing something, in my experience, the arts don't cure anything at all. And I said, so what do they do in your experience? And he says, well, they help us acknowledge the pain that we felt. They help us imagine a more hopeful future. They help us find a meaning in what's happened that is personally authentic, that allows us to endure. It helps us practice our skills. It helps create a sense of community. It helps us honor and celebrate those moments of joy. And I said, well, you've just basically paraphrased the WHO definition of mental health. It's not about solely the elimination of illnesses and disabilities and conditions. It's not merely about surviving. It's about thriving. And then he began to explain the difference between Western notions of aesthetics and African notions and how, and began to quote Brecht and Stanislavski and Pirandello. And I said, where did you get your training? And he said, oh, the internet. And I said, is that your only training? And he said, no, I come from a village in the north where as a young child I was picked out to be part of this group that would create these performances for the king. And the difference between what you do and what we do is that these performances, there was no distinction between dance and song and story and visual arts. In fact, there was no distinction between a healing ceremony, a political ceremony, an athletic event, a performance. It was all the same thing. And so I had the privilege of getting this deep dive short course in African aesthetics. So now here I am in Athens, and my mind goes back to a family trip that I took with my sons a number of years ago when they were small. And being a former performer, I can't resist going to ancient Greek amphitheaters when I find them, and there's a plum one right next to the Acropolis. So I went in to test the perfect acoustics, and if you haven't done it, please do. So I went up and started practicing reciting my classical monologues, much to the embarrassment of my sons. And I noticed that while I was there in this temple of Dionysus, right next door was a temple of Asclepius, an ancient hospital. And I did a little bit of research, and I found out that the Greek conception of health was that in the morning, you would go to the temple of Asclepius, the ancient hospital, and bathe in the waters of Hygienia and purge your body. And then in the afternoon, you would cross the alleyway to the temple of Dionysus and purge your soul. That what I was witnessing in marble was the asexual division between arts and health from their unified ritual whole, where it came from. And what would happen on that ancient Greek stage? The catastrophe that they would dramatize wouldn't disappear, but through that aesthetic purging, the characters, and therefore the audience, would transform. It didn't erase what happened, it didn't cure anything, it was a moment of transformation. So the blind would not regain their sight, they would find another type of vision. And I thought about my situation and my own crushing sense of loss, of what I could no longer do, and my crushing sense of dread of how was I going to function in this world without my sight, and how I, in my own pathway, through aesthetic engagement, found a way of being in that present moment, training my other senses through the arts in different ways to see and engage the world in a different way. Just as you willingly close your eyes to better savor a glass of red wine, just as you willingly close your eyes to better embody a beautiful piece of music, just as you willingly close your eyes to better trace the gentle slope of a lover's forearm, so too do I accept the closing of my eyes to better share this moment with you. Thank you.
My name is Naia Kete. I founded a program called Song Healing Trauma. And I will never forget meeting one of the first participants of that program. He was a young man named Yamar. We met at his therapist's office. Her name is Jessica Protis and is a dear friend and collaborator in this work. And when he walked into the room, the first thing I noticed about this young man was that he had a big knife in his pocket. And Jess was like, Yamar, why did you come into the room with a knife? You don't need a knife here. And he's like, yes, I do. And then Jess walks out the room and shuts the door and leaves the two of us in the room. And all I know about this man is that he's young, he comes from a poor neighborhood, he's traumatized and has a knife. And here I am alone for an indefinite period of time with this young man. And then what happens next moves me. He kind of took me in for a moment and said, you know what, I don't need to hold on to the knife. You hold on to the knife. And he handed me the knife handle first. And I took the knife and I held it in my hand for a second, just receiving the depth of this moment and I placed it on the table between us. And Yamar then proceeded to tell me a story that I share with permission of how he had been serially sexually abused by his stepfather from the time he was a child up through his teenage years. When I left the room that day, I felt sick. His was just the first of many stories, horror stories I heard that day. And here I was tasked with translating that trauma into song. And so when it came time to actually translate Yamar's story, I composed a song on his behalf, and I sent it to Jess, his therapist. And she replied, she said, I don't know if I want you to share this with him, and I don't want to get in the way of your artistic integrity or expression, but I'm afraid it's going to re-traumatize him. And something in my gut just told me that that wouldn't be the case. Something in me just knew, but I said, okay, Jess, let's talk to him first. So before I played him the song for the first time, the three of us were sitting in conversation with one another, and Jess was sharing how the reason she became a therapist was she wanted to go into the spaces where God didn't exist and bring light to those spaces. And then she looked at Yamar and she said, like, what happened to you? God didn't exist in that space. And he looked almost taken aback for a moment, almost angry, and said, what are you talking about? Of course God existed. If that hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't have met you. You wouldn't have introduced me to Naia. Naia wouldn't have written this song that I haven't even heard yet, and I know is going to impact not only my own healing, but the healing of generations. And so then I sang, there is no love here. He raped my soul. Whatever innocence I was born with, he stole. I was just a child. I think that's what he liked. Now that I'm a mermaid, I'm learning how to fight without your violent adoration. Every violation coming all over me, coming all over, all over. It's all over. When I finished singing the song for Yamar, he looked at me and he just said, yes, that's it. And that was all I needed. And so now there's this body of work, these series of songs that in its pilot phase was generously supported by an organization called Artists at Work. And that's why I'm here right now. This organization put artists like myself on salary during a pandemic, with the only assignment being write a song, use your art to create a social impact element, right? Use your art to better your local community. And I was like, well, that's what I've been saying. I've been doing that this whole time. What happens when I actually do it, right? And so that's what this was born out of. And I'm here today because Artists at Work, a couple of years later, are still providing opportunities for me to amplify the voices of these youth that I was privileged to work with. And the next phase is sharing this music worldwide, releasing these songs, and amplifying these stories. And I feel so honored to be alongside my panelists today, in a room with each and every one of you, for an opportunity to continue to find partners and community to collaborate with, to help amplify these messages and these stories. Thank you.
Years ago, I was sitting alone at a piano in a big dark room, not unlike this one, and I was writing a song that would change the trajectory of my career as a touring songwriter and eventually lead me here with you all today. I had, from a young age, written songs as a way to process and share things that I couldn't talk about otherwise. And that night, what I was processing was my family's history of domestic violence. And in particular, the fact that so many women survivors lived with this haunted fear that what had happened to them was somehow their fault. And that fear was so unfair and so painful. So the chorus of the song that I wrote that night just said, "You did, you did everything right. You did, you did everything right." I didn't think I would play that song for anyone. It felt way too personal. But a few weeks later, I played it at a concert, and afterwards, that was the song everyone lined up wanting to talk to me about. They said things like, "That song is my story too," or "I needed that message too," or "I thought it was my fault too." So I made a commitment that I would play that song at every show from then on. And as a result, over the years, I've had hundreds of people stay after shows and share with me really personal stories about abuse, about mental illness, about suicide ideation. And many of them would follow that up by saying, "I'm the first person they had ever told." Think about that. If I'm the first person they had ever told, that means they'd never told a doctor or a therapist, not even a spouse or partner. It means that community resources that are designed to meet the needs of people with those experiences were clearly never reaching those individuals. So what was it about a music venue, about a singer, about a song, that made those stories speakable for the first time? And what are the implications of that for our health? If you zoom out from that question, you get to this one. What do we not know about so many populations and experiences because people cannot or will not share about those experiences in the ways that we expect or demand of them? These same questions came up when I founded Project Uncaged. It's a trauma-informed creative writing workshop for girls that are incarcerated. And I don't know if it'll surprise you all to learn that girls share really different information in their poems and songs than they ever share in questionnaires or surveys or even in conversations sitting around a table. So again, what do we not know about young people in the juvenile justice system? Because we tend to ask questions in such incredibly limited ways. I went from music to a PhD in public health sciences to get some answers to these questions. And I now direct research for the International Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where we study all kinds of effects of the arts on our health and mental health. We have a new initiative with the WHO where we're studying how arts and culture can support youth mental health globally. I'd love to talk with any of y'all about that. And to all of our work in the lab, I bring this history I've described to you, this question, what do we not know? Here's the thing. Humans evolved to make and share art for a reason. It serves us in some way. Otherwise, we would have abandoned this practice millennia ago, right? One of the ways that it serves us is that it expands our range of communication. It extends what we're able to think about and process, what we're able to bear witness to and share. And we ignore this fact at our peril. I could tell you all about mental health studies where the things we learned from participants' creative writing were critical to our ability to help them, and those same things were completely missed by the surveys that were administered in the same study. The things that we don't learn and don't know when we exclude the arts will harm us. So for each of you here in your roles, what do you not know? If we want to advance mental health, we have to reintegrate the arts with our practices. We have to rehumanize our work. We have to ask, what are we missing when we exclude this fundamental aspect of the human experience? And I'm so glad to be with you all here, because if the question is, what are we missing? This is an ideal time and place to decide. We have to find out, right? Thank you all.
Hi, everyone. I'm Constantina Theofanopoulou, and I'm a neuroscientist. My research focuses on how humans, and human brains in particular, are able to produce very complex sensory motor behaviors that enable us to communicate, which is what we're doing here now. And so the two main behaviors of communication that I'm working on are speech, what I'm doing right now, and dance, that I'm doing at my free time. I'm also very interested in finding out therapies whenever there are deficits in these behaviors. And I'm working on both drug therapies with a focus on oxytocin, but also on art behavioral therapies with a focus on dance therapy. And this is where I think that several disorders come into the conversation. Like, for example, autism spectrum disorders or Parkinson's disease that I'm working on. Because what's happening is that in these disorders, we see several mental health issues that do not only take the shape of mood disorders, depression, anxiety, they also take the shape of basic communicative deficits. For example, as is the case of the speech deficits that I'm working on. So in these cases, I think that dance and dance therapy can be truly impactful. But I was not able to understand this until I started studying dance in parallel with speech. Because both speech and dance, they share several similarities. First of all, both speech and dance are motor behaviors. So although you cannot see them right now, while I'm speaking, my laryngeal muscles are constantly moving extremely fast here. In the same way that while we're dancing, our arms and our legs are moving constantly in order for us to move to the rhythm of the dance, right? Secondly, both of these behaviors require that we coordinate very well, that we integrate very well an auditory stimulus to a motor output. So in the case of speech, in order for us to speak in the right way, we need to be able to hear what our interlocutor has to say. As also we need to hear the beat of the music that we're listening to in order to entrain our body movements to the beat of the music, right? Third, and more importantly, what we've been finding preliminarily in our research is that while we're speaking, we're activating in our brain some of the same brain regions that we activate while we're dancing. And this really surprised us, specifically for a specific brain region that is called the laryngeal motor cortex. So this part of the brain is responsible to actually send projections down here to our laryngeal muscles so that they move, so that we produce vocalizations while we're speaking. And we, of course, did not expect to find it activated while we're dancing, right? We don't move our laryngeal muscles while we're dancing, but we did. And this means that both speech and dance share partly overlapping brain pathways. So all this information that we found led me to hypothesize that it could be that through dance, we could actually stimulate activity in the brain regions that are involved in speaking. In this way, through dancing, not with speech therapy, through dancing, we could help improve speech of people with speech deficits. And we've started working on it on a population that shows both deficits in general body movements, but also deficits in the laryngeal muscle movements of the speech, being the population that suffers from Parkinson's disease. And so thankfully, there is already before us an array of great studies that has shown that dance and dance therapy can significantly improve their general deficits in the body movements. For example, we see tremor, bradykinesia, or gait freezing in Parkinson's disease. What no one has studied so far is whether dance can actually have an impact on another motor deficit, which is how they move their laryngeal muscles, that of course affects their speech. I assume that no one has done it so far because no one had made or studied the link between speech and dance in the way that we do. And so far there is one clue from our research that tells me that this hypothesis of having dance affect how we speak is actually on the right track. So very recently we ran a reanalysis of a study that had several Parkinson's disease patients undergo dance training for 8 months. Among other things, they studied how their brain activity changed over these 8 months. In our reanalysis, we found that one of the brain regions that showed a differential activity throughout these 8 months of dancing was the laryngeal motor cortex. That so far, we just know that it sends projections down to the larynx to activate our laryngeal muscle so that we speak. So what this shows to me is that by dancing, we can produce significant differences in the way our laryngeal motor cortex works. So through dancing, it could be that these changes in the brain actually eventually affect how we speak. So right now, we're studying in these Parkinson's disease populations how actually dance over some months also affects their speech. And in the future, we have plans to also run the same studies in developmental disorders, like in children with autism spectrum disorders and speech deficits. I haven't said that, but I also happen to be an awarded flamenco dancer. And so this is the point in my life that I am able to bring my interests together and to have my experience in dance inform my neuroscientific framework in my studies. And this is very, very beautiful because I've experienced the great health benefits that dance can have on mental health, on several aspects of our mental health. But I was never expecting that I would be able to even take it further and see whether dance can exert specific effects on very specific aspects of mental health, like the way we communicate or the way we speak. Thank you so much.
Now, we have a couple of minutes before we get to the Q&A, and I'd like to take advantage of that for a couple of comments myself. You'll notice that with the speakers, myself included, we've deliberately tried to include a bit of the artistic expression in the delivery of our remarks, because part of the whole point of this Arts and Health connection is that our ways of knowing are not just in the frontal cortex and our conscious mind and our problem-solving abilities. It's not just the bullet points in the PowerPoint slide. It's about tapping into the midbrain, tapping into this sense of a shared experience, the mirror neurons, the other sensory ways of knowing that make something more meaningful and a deeper connection. And we've tried to embody that a little bit. And in particular, Tasha, who I know as a brilliant researcher because she actually undercut her role. She not only works for Johns Hopkins, but also University of Florida. Both of them are collaborating centers with our network at WHO. But I've now seen a totally different side of her and feel like I know you much deeper than I had before. So that's a gift to me. And Naia, just in a few minutes, I feel like I've shared your journey. But Constantina, you did not dance.
So for this to happen, I will just do a bit of what we're calling in flamenco zapateado, which is the footwork, right? But I will need your help, okay? Which is that I want you to clap to the rhythm of that I will start clapping, and don't, focus on exactly what I'm doing. Just focus on your rhythm of your claps, okay? Help me. Thank you.
We promise.
Okay, so.
Thank you.
Now, I bring this up not only to embarrass my colleague publicly, but also to show a different aspect of what we're doing. That rhythm that we just heard was almost identical to the rhythm that I just heard 2 weeks ago on the streets of Lagos in the drumming circles. And it reminded me of how in the American South during slavery, how drums were banned. And that's how tap dancing developed, was an almost subversive way of keeping that rhythm alive. And when we think about the WHO definition of health, which includes physical, mental, but also social well-being, and is deeply tied to issues of equity, because the chain of human health is only as strong as its weakest link, as we saw in the pandemic in the last few years, that you cannot extinguish this human need to express, no matter where you are. And part of when we look at arts and health, it's not just about using the arts to express health messaging. It's recognizing that this need to express is actually part of what makes us human, and therefore part of our definition of health. And as long as our heart beats and our lungs breathe, we will always have that rhythm, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. So now I think we're at the Q&A session, so I'd like to hand it over to our student journalist colleague who will take over, because I can't see whether you want questions or not. So.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. It was amazing. We were crying backstage. Thank you for dancing, singing. So now to the audience, I want to remind you that you can use the app, the Theofanopoulou app, to ask your questions. You can submit them there and I will find them on the phone. And alternatively, you can raise your hand and you will get the microphone. So now off to the audience. Yep.
Thank you, that was beautiful. What is the gap that you see in resources to bring arts more forward into connecting arts with healing? Because now, especially in the US, with schools, they want to take the arts out. That's the first thing that goes, which I believe is the first thing that needs to stay to accelerate the creativity in the mind and the different parts of the brain. So if everyone has their own opinion, I would love to hear what the gap is that you see that we can close and now create the bridge for that.
Well, this is part of my job, so maybe you guys should go first. If you
I mean, funding. I think, I was at a conversation earlier where he was talking about the different eras that we've been through recently, being scientific era and industrial era, things of that nature. And with the industrial era came an education system that taught us how to be factory workers. Mm-hmm. And so we're still living that in the school systems. And I think the way that information is being disseminated right now, we're learning at such a higher rate than we can integrate in academic fields. And so I think that's a big reason why we lack funding for the arts, is because even though there's a lot of really great information out there about how impactful the arts can be in an educational setting, the information isn't getting disseminated or integrated. That's what I've seen.
Thank you.
Yeah, I could share my thoughts. Thank you for the question. I think so. So if we speak about the US and several other countries, of course, what we see, the landscape that we see, is that the arts are not really recognized as an official, let's say, part member, even of our medical insurance system, right? Even very slowly, recently, psychotherapy started being recognized and covered, right? So this is a challenge, but I tend to see obstacles as good challenges in my life. And what I see, and I can understand from the perspective of those that make these decisions, is that there is not great evidence for the arts so far, meaning tangible evidence, numbers, right? And this is what I think that several of us are trying to do now, which is to give them these numbers. If you want to see that 80% of the people that have Parkinson's disease and that do dancing have XYZ improvement in their intonation, prosody, the way they speak, then they will be responsible, and they will be the ones who will eventually integrate it in the system. So, of course, I think that there is some evidence, and there is probably some more evidence that in several other fields that are recognized and integrated, unfortunately. But let's take it as a challenge and say, okay, since they're asking for it, since they're asking and waiting for strong data, let's give them the best we have, okay? So this is the way I'm trying to see it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just add to that too. Thank you all so much. I'm in the business in my job of producing evidence, the way that Constantina is, and oftentimes people are asking for evidence, and I have two thoughts that I'll just share with you all, which is that evidence is incredibly important, and also in our society, very few decisions are actually made based on evidence. People want to say that these decisions are based on evidence, and actually they're making decisions based on sociocultural norms, based on what's expedient, based on what's economically efficient or whatever, not based on what's actually best for human beings. So I think arts can also be a part of changing sociocultural norms and expectations and demands of a public that may need to demand what they need to in order to thrive. And I would also just say that there is not necessarily evidence to remove the arts. Nobody required RCTs to show that it's okay to take art out of schools, but some people are demanding similar studies to reintegrate us as human beings. And so oftentimes I'm kind of like put in this position of like, give us the evidence for the utility or the benefits of the arts, and I'm like, give me the evidence that it's not beneficial, given that we've been doing this for millennia, right?
So at WHO, one of the things we focus on, particularly through the Jameel Arts and Health Lab, which I co-founded with some partners, is this virtuous triad between research, practice, and policy. Because it's not just we need money, we need the policy in which the money can flow. And that we're actually seeing some shifts. The Australian government just a few months ago released their new cultural policy, and as part of that, it included a requirement to have arts therapists in every home for the aged and the elderly, and that was based on research from the University of Melbourne. We have seen, well, I was just in Ireland a few weeks ago opening the first National Arts and Health Resource Centre in Waterford, and that's a shift. In the US, you have last September, the executive order that came out of the White House calling for an all-of-government approach to cultural institutions. And if you actually read that document, the third paragraph explicitly says, for the purpose of improving health on an individual and community level. And that's huge. They're not saying it's just to preserve cultural identity or to spur the creative economy, which have been the old arguments, but a new argument that recognizes the value of the arts intrinsic to health. How do we do that at WHO? Well, we took a small program in the UK called Music and Mums, which was essentially singing groups to help women who were managing postpartum depression find their way through. And what was significant about this little program was, first, there was a randomized control trial. So there was a control group where they used play groups instead of singing groups, and there was a marked difference when they sang, and that was interesting. The other was the focus, that it wasn't solely on the child's well-being, but the focus was on the mother's well-being. And that was an interesting shift. From that, WHO was able to encourage national pilots in Denmark, Romania, and Italy. And in the fall, when the numbers come out, the EU will be involved in that discussion, where if the numbers hold up, they've already committed to rolling it out across the region. So that's an example of the pathway to policy. The money is there. The question is, how do you unlock it?
Another point I wanted to add on that, just on what you said, is that a big difficulty that we have in the arts is the topic of reproducibility. Because what's happening when you have a drug therapy, right? It's the same drug, right? You can inject it, let's say, to anyone. It's the same drug. What's happening in the arts that I've been trying to face is that, let's say, for example, that we use dance, right, as dance therapy.
We only have 1 minute left.
Yeah, as dance therapy. But it's very difficult to have the same, let's say, choreography dance class for many different groups across the globe. So we have to write a protocol that says we will do in minute 1 of the dance class this, in minute 2 of the dance class that. And in this way, this drag dance will also be reproducible. So this is another thing I want to add.
We will have to be really quick with the next question. I heard about policy, so we have here the former Deputy Minister of Culture in Greece.
Hi, actually, I wanted to follow up on your policy discussion. We actually, inspired by the WHO 2019 report on arts and mental health, we launched a national cultural prescription program during the pandemic. So in order to address some of the issues you're talking, we're doing 2 things. One is the research thing so that we have the evidence. The other one touches upon what you said, which is we are feeling that we're missing the framework and the methodology. So who prescribes what to whom, how often, when, and where. So what is your take on that?
Just 30 seconds.
I can say, because Chris is writing the foreword to it, we're about to come out with with an arts on prescription guide. It's based in the US, but hope that can give some groundwork for like theories behind it and processes that people have found successful.
So now's your chance to influence it because I haven't written it yet.
Thank you all so much for your participation. You can meet the speakers outside. We have no time. I'm so sorry. You can continue the conversation outside. For those of you who want to remain, you can immerse yourself in the experience of Vamvakou village. It's in southern Greece. So the rest of you can go out and we will meet back in about 10 minutes.